Welcome to this edition of Cranmer Readings, Part 1. We're in Justus Ridley's The Book of Common Prayer in Cranmer, and we note, it's chapter 18, we notice that Somerset and Cranmer are moving slowly in 1547 after the death of the king. They fear the imputation or impugnment that they're doing things under the radar of the young King Edward VI. But the homilies which Cranmer is pushing, 3 of which he wrote, the homily of salvation, the homily of true and lively faith, and the homily on good works, are creating theological gas and indigestion for Wiley Winchester. Cranmer and Ridley decide to have a little chat with Wiley Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, and they offer him a seat on the council. He'd been booted off per Henry's wishes if he will but accept the homilies. Gardiner, being a deviant man himself, smells a bribe, and he's right. A quid pro quo. Machiavellian, maybe. Do this and get that. A little horse trading. Gardiner's having none of it and is indignant, and he gets a room and a bed in the Fleet prison. Things were moving slow in 1547 and 48, but orders were given to get rid of the images, get rid of the ashes for Ash Wednesday and the palms for Palm Sunday. And more in London, unauthorized vernacular worship services are being tried. Licenses get revoked in some cases, and if you don't agree, here, take your ticket to the prison. They were afraid of going too fast. So we pick up there as we discuss the Book of Common Prayer. The cautious policy that did not succeed in appeasing the conservatives. In January 1548, the council released Gardiner from prison. He'd made only a very qualified submission with regard to the homilies, but he continued his opposition by devious means in his diocese. In June, he defied an order from the protector prohibiting him from dealing with controversial issues concerning the sacraments when he preached before the king on St. Peter's Day. He spoke about the real presence and transubstantiation in the sermon in open defiance of Somerset. The next day, the council committed Gardiner to the Tower. The minutes of the meeting of the council were signed by Somerset, Cranmer, Paulet, Shawley, and Russell. The same Russell who 5 years before had been present at the meeting of the council when Gardiner's faction had decided to send Cranmer to the Tower. It's important to keep these players in mind because they flip-flop and are fair weather vanes blown with the wind. Gardiner believed he'd been in prison for defending the real presence, but for Cranmer, it was a case of punishing a most willful disobedience to royal authority. Cranmer and Somerset had shown 6 months earlier that they could overlook disobedience in their friends, would not overlook disobedience in their friends any more than in their opponents. The Marquis of Northampton, the brother of Catherine Parr, wished to divorce his wife who'd committed adultery and marry Elizabeth Brooke, the daughter of Lord Cobham. Elizabeth's uncle was in Cranmer's service and had married his niece. In April 1547, a commission was established to decide whether, after a divorce for adultery, the spouses were free to remarry. Cranmer presided over the commission and made an exhaustive analysis of the conflicting opinions of the early fathers and the decisions of the general councils with regard to remarriage of one or both parties after a divorce for adultery. While the commissioners delayed giving their judgment, Northampton grew impatient and cohabited with Elizabeth Brooke, but he was unfortunate in being confronted with Somerset and Cranmer, who were perhaps the only two men in authority who were not prepared to tolerate illegality in influential peers. Northampton, the brother of the Queen Dowager, and one of the members of the inner council which ruled the realm under the Protector, was forced to appear before his colleagues and to separate from Elizabeth Brooke, who was ordered to reside in the house of Catherine Parr. 3 months later, in April 1548, Cranmer and the commissioners, acting on the advice of a group of lawyers, gave judgment that where a spouse committed adultery, both spouses were free to remarry, as the adultery had terminated the marriage. 4 years later, Cranmer's Code of Ecclesiastical Law allowed for the innocent spouse to remarry after divorce, and Burnet suggested that in Northampton's case, some of his commissioners disagreed with that decision. Even if this were true, and there's no real evidence of it, it's very unlikely that the commission would have given a judgment to which Cranmer was seriously opposed. It's therefore clear that Cranmer had altered his opinion since 1540, when he'd written to Osiander in connection with a bigamous marriage of Philip Hesse, that marriage after divorce was never lawful. In Northampton's case, Cranmer was not granting a decree of nullity for reasons of state. It was determining the important theological question as to whether the parties to a valid marriage could in any circumstances remarry during the lifetime of their spouse. He reached a decision which was satisfactory to Northampton and extended to the wife of this great nobleman a privilege which was later refused to other guilty wives. We need not assume that Cranmer was in fact affected by improper considerations. When kings were not involved, Cranmer did not allow anyone, however powerful, to influence him in the exercise of his judicial duties. He'd certainly give proof of this in Northampton's case. In the summer of 1548, Cranmer conducted a visitation of his diocese. His purpose was to ensure that the Reformation in Kent had gone as far as the Protector had ordered, and no further. He drafted a list of 86 matters which the visitors were to investigate concerning the obedience of the clergy to the king's injunctions and the conduct of the people. One of these matters investigated was whether the sacrament was placed in the sepulchre on Good Friday. From this it has been deduced that Cranmer was going ahead of the council and suppressing in his diocese one of the two remaining ceremonies which had not yet been abolished. It is much more likely that he was dutifully seeking to enforce obedience and to compel the extremists to comply with the order of the 6th of February by observing the ceremonies that had not yet been repressed. Cranmer did not, however, inquire as to whether any priest was secretly married, but on the contrary asked whether anyone was criticizing married priests and refusing to take communion from them. The bill permitting priests to marry had not yet reached the House of Lords, but evidently Cranmer and the government treated it as law already. The drafting of a new communion service in which both the bread and wine would be administered to the communicants was probably entrusted to a commission of 13 bishops and divines. There can be very little doubt that Cranmer presided over the meetings at Windsor, and he played the leading part in drafting the Order of Communion, which was issued 8 March 1548. The document was very short, though the form of service contained in it considerably longer than the one which it replaced. It did not interfere in any way with the Mass, which was still conducted according to the old Sarum use. It merely added it to the communion service for the benefit of those few members of the congregation who would come to Mass in order to communicate. Not only to gossip with their neighbors and pursue their debtors. But the Order of Communion contained some innovations. The general confession which preceded the communion expressly told the people that though it was proper to confess their sins to a priest, they must not condemn those who chose not to do so, but preferred to confess directly to God. And the priest was directed that in the event of being necessary to consecrate more bread during the administration, he was not to elevate the host. This was enough to alarm the conservatives, who interpreted the Order of Communion as abolishing the Mass, although in fact it not only did not interfere with the Mass, but expressly forbade anyone from doing so. But the king's preface to the book clearly hinted that alterations would be made in the Mass in the near future. This led the reformers to welcome the Order of Communion. It had been suggested that some of the words and phrases used in the Order of Communion indicate that the men who drafted it did not believe in real presence. But there are other words which indicate exactly the opposite, and it's unlikely that Cranmer intended to make any great innovation to the communion service. He and Somerset seemed to have been alarmed that they had done so much, especially when disorders broke out in the churches, and they did not attempt to enforce the prohibition against the elevation of the host. In June, Vanderdelft told Prince Philip of Spain that the Mass was once more said in all the churches. There is, however, considerable doubt as to the opinions with regard to Eucharist which Cranmer held at this time. We know that in 1550 he believed in a doctrine which he expressed in his books on the sacrament. This doctrine fell short of the extreme Sacramentarian position and of that of Zwingli, and it may even fallen short of the modified Zwinglianism of Bullinger and Hooper and their followers. But it went as far as the doctrines of Peter Martyr, farther than those of Bucer and far beyond Lutheranism. Despite all the many variations on the Eucharist, the burning issue was whether Christ was really present in the sacrament, not only in a spiritual sense, but corporeally, in substance. In this sense, Cranmer did not believe in the real presence in 1550, and according to the writer, who was perhaps cheek, he had ceased to believe it in 1546. But 2 years later, Cranmer was acting as if he still believed in the real presence, and everyone was convinced that he did. As late as the autumn of 1547, Cranmer was sitting in judgment on a sacramentary Sacramentary. When a gentleman and his wife at Wrestle in Yorkshire discovered that their servant did not believe in the real presence, they sent him to Cranmer, not to Archbishop Holgate, for punishment. Cranmer committed the man to prison, though we do not know how he ultimately dealt with the case. It is clear that the master and mistress had no doubt of Cranmer's orthodoxy on the sacrament of the altar. In view of Cranmer's attitude during the first 2 years of Edward's reign, it has often been suggested that Cranmer was converted on the question of the Eucharist not by Ridley, but by John Lasco in 1548. The true explanation is probably that Cranmer's conversion was a gradual and irregular process. In light of all the facts, we can form a conjecture as to the development of his opinions on the Eucharist, that by 1538 he ceased to believe in transubstantiation and had embraced the Lutheran position. That in June 1539 he repudiated his opinion under duress and conformed to the old doctrine in the 6 Articles and the King's Book. That in 1546 he was persuaded by Ridley to renounce the real presence, at a time when Henry himself was suggesting that the Mass be suppressed. But when Henry died, Cranmer abandoned all hopes of rapid progress, believing that the repudiation of the real presence could only be proclaimed by an adult king. During 1547, the popular attacks on the sacrament must have caused a reaction in Cranmer's attitude. Cranmer believed that men should not come to the Lord's table as they come to other common meats and drinks, but with great fear and dread, because there is not only represented, but spiritually given unto us very Christ himself. This was a very different talk from a talk about a round robin, Jack in the Box, vile cake, a god made of fine flour. This kind of language probably revived all Cranmer's old horrors about sacramentaries. It led his mentor Ridley to forget his quarrels with Gardiner. "Why, my lord," said Ridley when Gardiner was arguing about justification, "what make you so great a matter therein? You see many Anabaptists rise against the sacrament of the altar. I pray you, my lord, be diligent in confounding them." The immediate task was to be diligent in confounding the Anabaptists, not to sow doubts by denying the real presence. So at the beginning of 1548, Cranmer did not advance beyond the Lutheranism in his questions and answers on the Mass and in the order of communion. When Gardiner was brought before the council on the 8th of January in order to be released from prison, Cranmer told him that he fully agreed with the doctrine of the presence which Gardiner had expressed in his book on the sacrament in 1546. In June, when Prince Philip was being reassured as to the worship of Mass in England, Cranmer issued a catechism for the instruction of English youth, which plainly asserted real presence. This was the catechism of the Lutheran churches in Nuremberg, which Cranmer translated into English from a Latin translation by Justus Jonas in the original German. At his trial, Cranmer agreed that he had translated it and referred to the English edition as my book. And it is clear that even if he did not understand the translation work himself, he accepted full responsibility for the English edition. The preface consisted of a letter from Cranmer to the king. In other ages, the archbishop dedicating a children's catechism to a 10-year-old king might have had some reference to the fact that the king was himself a child. But Cranmer did nothing so derogatory of the royal dignity and wrote that the king had decided on a gracious reformation of all ungodliness. He petitioned him to permit the catechism to be read to the children of his most loyal subjects. And we will have to call that here. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.